Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. It's great to see everyone on for this webinar. I'm John Gannon. I'm a product manager at DigitalOcean, and specifically I work on the DigitalOcean Marketplace. I'm joined by my colleague, engineering manager, Antonio Rosales. And today, what we're gonna talk to you about is how to cut the bike shedding. So for folks who might not be familiar with that term, bike shedding is really when your team is getting into an endless debate about what features to work on and why to work on them. And obviously you want to have debate and discussion within a team, but ultimately you need to get down to a decision and you need to act. And so what we want to do is actually share with you some real life stories from DigitalOcean that will help you align your team, cut the bike shedding, and show you how to do this using MVPs or minimum viable products that don't require a line of code. So really excited that you're here with us and really excited to share some of this with you. The webinar is going to be recorded and the video will be shared with you via email, and it will be posted on the DO YouTube channel and on the DigitalOcean community at do.co/techtalks. So you'll have a chance to review all of this later if you want to go back, if you feel like you missed anything, or if you want to share it with a colleague. If you have any questions, we're not going to answer them while we're going through the presentation, but we will answer as many as we can live afterwards at the end of the talk. So please just pop your questions in the question window. And if we don't get to your question live, we'll answer it in the next week or so, again, at do.co/techtalks. And we will include a link to that by email. So if you didn't have a chance to write it down, we'll get that to you. So I gave a description of what we're going to talk about today, but I can even simplify it further. At DO, we're all about simplicity and trying to do that in our products, but also in terms of anything we share with the community. And so really what you're going to learn today is how can you be sure that you're building the right thing? Because it's a question that always comes up, whether you're a product manager, whether you're an engineer, whether you're an entrepreneur. It's the $1 million or the £1 million question. And so there's a lot of things that we do at DigitalOcean and that frankly plenty of other people do in terms of trying to get to figure out, is it the right thing that you're building? And so how do we typically learn about what customers want and need so that we can figure out what is the right thing? So we might do user research and interviews. We might do some overarching market research on the web and whatnot. If we already have a customer base, we could look at support tickets, certainly. Hearing what customers are talking about our product or about related products on social media is another way. Running A/B tests if you have enough traffic on your site to be able to figure out how different variations may play into clicks or conversions. And then certainly there's web analytics. So actually seeing how users are interacting with your site, or mobile analytics to see how they're interacting with your app. So those are all things you can sort of do before you write a line of code. But sometimes what I see, and I've seen it at DigitalOcean. We're not innocent of this necessarily either. But I do see it with a lot of teams, so I want to bring it up. Is sometimes teams feel like they have a hunch, and so instead of doing all of these things or some of these things, they just ship it. So they say, let's just get it out there and let's see what happens. And I think that's okay in some cases when you're talking about a sort of a small bet, a small feature, something that's pretty straightforward for the team to put together pretty quickly and will allow you to maybe test a hypothesis that you have about your product or about your customers. But aside from all the things I just mentioned on the previous slide in terms of how you might learn what your customers want and what they need, and aside from just going the ship it route where you kind of put something out there and see what happens, there's other ways we can learn. And they're ways that have few or no dependency on others. And I bring this up specifically because if you work in a larger team or a larger organization, a lot of times there's a lot of coordination to kind of get things done. And so what we thought was really important is to highlight some techniques that we've used that we actually think are applicable whether or not you're at a company that's, say, DigitalOcean size, or if maybe you're a really small team just getting started on a new startup product. This can apply to you as well. And so let's dig in a little bit more and talk about this. And again, I want to give you really specific examples that you can take yourself or build on in terms of helping build your own product or test your own hypotheses about what your users want. And even better, the things we're going to share are low or no risk. And they're things, like I said, you can start doing right now by yourself if you want. Certainly involve your team if you want or you can, but there's really nothing stopping you. And that's one of the key messages here, that these tactics can be used by anyone at any time. So it was in the title of the presentation in terms of what tools we wanted to actually show you, right? And we mentioned that we want to talk to you about no-code MVPs. So before we give the specific examples, MVP is a term that gets, I think, thrown around a bit loosely without a real clear definition of what it means. So I don't want to necessarily talk about all the different definitions, but I want to talk about the definition that we're going to use for the purposes of this discussion to really frame it up for you so that when we give the examples, it'll be very clear in terms of how they fit into this. So what is an MVP? So again, an MVP, for the purposes of what we're talking about, is a product. And by product, again, I said, get ready for some air quotes. What I mean by a product is something that a user can interact with. Doesn't necessarily have to be software-based, but it has to be something that elicits a reaction from a potential user. It's got to have enough features. So the product and sort of what it can do, whether it's a code or a no-code product, MVPs can be of both styles. So making sure it has enough features to allow you to get feedback from early adopter customers or users. And really the goal is you want this to be able to help you validate a product idea that you have. And so I'm going to hand it over to Antonio to talk a little bit more in detail about what an MVP is and what it isn't.
Thanks, John. I'm a little more of a visual learner, so one of the pictures that really resonates with me is this idea of what an MVP could look like. And as John said, a MVP is a product. It elicits some response from a user. And ideally, your MVP at each iteration is staying open to feedback and is providing some value to the user. So, well, any analogy falls short here. This analogy of transportation, saying, hey, I have an idea for a product that I want to provide value to a user for transportation. On the first row, you see the person has an idea of what their end goal should be and doesn't deviate from that. And at each iteration, tries to provide something to the user, but unfortunately, in the first 3 iterations, it's not providing any happiness for the user. In fact, there's a lot of dissatisfaction at each stage. Whereas ideally, in the second row, you can provide value at each iteration to the user and get valuable feedback. So while it may not be your intended end goal at each iteration, if you're open, you can get feedback, valuable feedback from the user, and also will provide some valuable product product value to the user at each iteration, so they can get some use from transportation here at each point. So we get feedback, provide value, and we learn along the way.
Okay, so with that framing and that background, we're going to now share 2 stories from our team actually about MVPs. And like I said, neither of these actually required any code, and they taught us a lot, and they helped us to make some key decisions in terms of what we would focus the team on and what features we would work on and things like that. So after we do that, we'll stop, and we'll certainly have time for questions, like I said, but also if your question is about an MVP you're considering, we'd love to hear that as well. So the first story is what did we learn, or what we learned by emailing 10 DO customers. Let me give you a little background. So we have different apps in the marketplace. We have over 150 applications today, and there are certain apps that are similar to one another, right? They kind of serve the same customer. It's the same kinds of use cases that they tackle and help the customer with. So what I wanted to do is test the hypothesis I had, and the hypothesis I had was that for customers who used a certain app in the marketplace, if they gave up on that app quickly, my hypothesis was that if we let them know about another app that's similar, that could potentially meet their need, that they would be interested in trying that app as well. So rather than sort of losing that customer, we actually have a chance to keep that customer because we're telling them in essence, hey, here's this other thing that may meet your need. And so rather than going to Antonio and asking, hey, can we go and sort of build this big thing? What I thought is, well, let me test this on a really small scale before anyone writes a line of code. And let me see if I can actually just get users to sort of do this manually before I develop sort of a case around why we should do this and talk about it with the team. Let me get some initial data to see if there's smoke, so to speak, before there's fire. And I have the actual email below where I'm emailing the user, and this is literally the exact email that I sent. And as you can see, it's just kind of a regular old email. It's right from my own email account, just conversational, and just gives that user the context about why I'm writing and what I'm asking them to do. And so what happened? Well, I emailed those 10 customers. One of them actually spun up the alternate one-click I suggested. So 10 customers is not necessarily a statistically significant sample size, but I was able to see that there was at least one user who was receptive to that. And I don't actually know other users. I didn't go and I didn't have a tracker on the links. So there could have been other users who actually went, looked at the app, maybe even went and attempted to create it or started to go through that process, right? And then the second thing I'd point out here is that aside from testing that hypothesis, a user who I had emailed, one of those 10, actually just wrote back with some general product feedback, which was sort of a nice bonus in that it's always great to hear from your customers. And so to get some other feedback about how they're using your product as a part of your core hypothesis testing or your core MVP is a great thing. So in this experiment, I want to point out a couple of things, and I alluded to it when I started talking about this example, but one is we didn't get yelled at for doing this, and not that people are running around DO yelling at each other, but what I mean by that is I picked a group of 10 users. Obviously, DO has a large number of users, but I picked a very small group. So even if, for some reason, if there was a user who maybe didn't like that I had reached out to them directly or something like that, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't have been a huge issue, right? Versus if I went to our marketing team and I said, let's send this email out to 2,000 people at once and see what they say. So I'm starting with, again, this, you think about Antonio, what he talked about, you sort of, when you're building the MVP, right, you start with, it's the skateboard, right? And then you turn it into the scooter, and then you turn it into the motorcycle, right? So this was kind of like the skateboard in that example. And this data was actually very useful because I then took this data to the marketing team and was able to share that there might be something here that we could potentially lean into and perhaps automate so that we could do this in a more regular automatic way. And that's sort of where we are now, where we're really starting to explore that and test that out with a slightly larger population of users. But again, if we didn't do that MVP, where I just emailed 10 users by hand, we might not have sort of had the justification or the data to suggest that we should do something a little bit bigger based on what we learned. So the second story is what we learned from a Google form. And this story also is related to the marketplace, which is the product that Antonio and I work on. And I wanted to share a little bit of history about the marketplace. The marketplace has been live for about a year and a half. And one of the things that we did prior to launching the marketplace is we made a conscious decision as a team that it was more important to get the marketplace to market faster versus holding back the marketplace to develop some marketplace management tools for the vendors in our marketplace. The vendors are the folks who list their apps in the marketplace. And so what we decided is in the beginning, we would just actually use a simple Google form for the vendors to be able to submit their applications or submit changes to their applications that would be in the marketplace. And obviously, we took that form and then we took the data out of it and we did some manual work to make the updates to the vendors' applications or to list their applications in the first place in the marketplace. And so we did that because that Google form, right, even though it's kind of ugly, it's kind of clunky, but what it meant is we could more easily experiment, right? A Google form is super, super easy to change, right? Easy to change text, easy to change the title, easy to change what fields are in it, right? You know, it's not an application, right? There's no coding, there's really no testing involved. It's just super simple. And so one of the things that this allowed us to test, and it's you know, it's really paid off for us, I think, in terms of the user interface we have in the vendor portal, is that we thought that using Markdown for certain fields would be easier for us and easier for our vendors. And so we made that change in the Google form. And that was like a 3-second change in the form. We made the change and really no one complained about it because originally we were doing HTML. And so Markdown was just, frankly, a lot easier for us and a lot easier for the vendors. And then the other effect this has is that it really allowed us to more effectively prioritize. So we could see, again, before we wrote any code for this sort of vendor portal or this app that the vendors would use, we really saw exactly how they were using the Google form, where they were getting stuck, what questions they asked about it. And so all of that really made trade-off and scoping discussions much, much easier because we had data about how the app, right, was being used. And so again, this form was our MVP that really helped us to learn by showing certain features that we thought were important and then seeing how users actually interacted with them, in this case, the marketplace vendors. And so this let us launch the marketplace 2 to 3 months earlier than we would have otherwise, and it removed a ton of risk because we didn't go down a road of building a full vendor portal and interface for the vendors when we didn't actually know with high degree of certainty what they would really need to be successful in the marketplace, to list their applications and to keep them up to date. And so that Google form as an MVP really gave us a way to do that. Now, were there trade-offs in the sense that we had to do more things by hand while we had that Google form in place? Absolutely. But the benefits we received in terms of being quicker to market and then being in a position to sort of build the right thing when we actually got to building, those far outweighed the downsides. And now I want to hand it back to Antonio because it's really important to understand both the product perspective of this, but also the engineering perspective of this.
Thanks, John. And as you said, we were trying to provide value to our users. And one of the things engineering that we had the inclination to do is right away start coding and start developing. And when we looked at the Google form, we're like, well, it's not exactly what we wanted to provide for folks. But the key point in there was that's not exactly what I wanted to provide to users. By talking to our vendors who were our customers in this aspect and our users, what really was needed was to actually get their application listed, right? So vendors were happy to have a faster iteration to get their actual listing to users, and users are happy because they're able to use the actual one-click faster. So taking our ideas out of it and trying to be objective and provide product value at each iteration, while engineering, we really didn't want to have a Google form be the final iteration. We provided value right away, And it was an interesting way for us to get objective data. So we all had opinions on what we thought should be developed, but providing this and running as an experiment allowed us to collect objective data that we could then have a lot more better negotiations about what we should develop, because now we're basing our opinions and our thoughts off of actual objective data. And it also provided us an important feedback loop. So we didn't onboard all our vendors. We went out and we started with a small set of vendors. We worked with them very closely. And by that, we were able to list their application, but we're also able to provide a good feedback loop to ask questions, what do they like, what they didn't like, and they just were glad to provide us information that we could translate into features into our overall design. And then it was also good for us to get that value to our vendors, and they felt engaged in the process. So by the end of the process, where we're able to provide them an actual portal, our vendors were more partners with us. You know, they felt like they had been part of the process. They had went to the Google Forms. They saw their feedback get implemented into actual features, and they were stronger partners with us, and they felt like they're part of the development. And that feedback loop, that engagement, and that objective data were critical to us to be able to provide a fast path, but also we felt a better product in the end. Back over to you, John.
Great, thanks, Antonio. So I wanted to leave you with one question. I know you probably have some questions, and hopefully you've been putting them in the chat window. And I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Samantha, but I want to leave you with the question we have for you, which is, what will you MVP? Over to you, Samantha.
Thanks so much, John and Antonio. I think the questions are still trickling in, so everyone please enter your questions in the questions box. The first question that we have is, how would you MVP a community metrics dashboard? A static page, an individual chart, or something else?
Okay, and community metrics, meaning, I'm going to assume you mean you have maybe it's like a discourse or something like that, where you're kind of have community discussions going on. And I think the question was, sorry, Sam, could you repeat the question one more time? I just want to make sure I get the gist of the last part of it specifically.
No problem. Or Eugenio, feel free to type in the questions box if you would like to clarify exactly what type of community metrics dashboard you're looking for. So our audience member wants to know, how would you MVP a community metrics dashboard? Would you use a static page, an individual chart, or something else? And Eugenio said it's for a tournament.
I see. Yeah, so one idea might be, like, I don't know what the time scale of a tournament is, but let's say the tournament's going on over a period of several days. You might actually experiment with, perhaps if it's easy to just manually run the data through something that would create a static page, if that is something that would save you sort of development time, and then just publish that static page in some kind of an interval. So rather than having the stats be perhaps real time, which might be the requirement initially, start off with perhaps publishing them multiple times a day, and then seeing how your users react, what questions they ask, what they like, what they don't like. Then you could determine, certainly, is this the right set of data? You could also determine, how frequently do I really need to provide it? For example, you might think real time, but maybe the users actually think it's great to get it once an hour, and that's fine with them. And so that could remove some complexity when you actually really start building something more dynamic. So those are some of the ideas for how you might tackle that specific MVP.
I want to add on to that, John, real quick too, is with the Google form, we had to go and manually make those listings initially, right? So that first iteration to create a static web page, which I think was one of your questions, could be, even if that's not your end result, the idea here at MVP is start with a static page and put it out to folks, even if the tournament hasn't started, and say, hey, what would folks think about if we did something like this? And then I think just getting that valuable feedback, even if you're just getting like a WordPress site and you're manually just making a graph, copy and pasting it even from like a Pages or Excel spreadsheet that makes a graph real quick, and you throw that into a static page, you just render that out onto like a WordPress site, and that's your first iteration you give to users and ask for feedback even before the tournament starts, or even if the tournament has started, and ask them for feedback, and then iterating from there, right? So it's saying, hey, it's not optimally where we want to be, but it's going to provide some value to folks.
Awesome, thank you. How do you guys at DigitalOcean MVP developer tooling like Doctal? How do you measure usage and get developer feedback?
Antonio, do you want to take that one? The team's been working on Doctal stuff recently, so thought that would be a good one for you.
Yeah, so we can look at API requests specifically coming in. And one of the things we've been taking a look at, even with Doctal, which is more of a command line tool versus a UI tool, is we've been exploring with our team on having our designers actually come in and look to see how we design out our actual command line environment. And the one thing that I would say, not so much developer tooling that we have that's improved our MVPs or in our first iterations with the command line environment, but it's taken the same rigor and practices that we do for any user interface element and applying that same rigor to the command line. So an MVP for a command environment like Doctal, the first iteration could literally be us writing out the nouns and verbs and command line options we want to pass to the actual Doctal or our API. So we have an idea that we want to create, we want to delete, we want to update, we want to do all those things via the command line. But it's very important to take a look at to see, like, how does the current Doctal work? What are the nouns? What are the verbs? What are the objects? And what are the flags? Writing those down, working with those designers and putting them into a user interface and then getting feedback with the team is how we get first iterations from those. We can also easily have an interview with a customer and say, hey, what if you're working with Doctal and you want to update a Kubernetes cluster and add a one-click? If the command looked like this, would that make sense to you? Or if I showed you this command, what do you think that does? And that's a real great example of an MVP in that we haven't even landed any code. We've basically just put some wire diagrams and some nouns and verbs on what we think the action would be and present it to folks, present it to our team, present it to John, present it to users if we want to, and get that feedback early on and make sure we got the right user experience through the command line. From there, we can then go and take a look at it, and we can run, there's beta elements that we have in our actual command line environment that we can get to beta users and get feedback from them and run interviews and see if folks are using it, if we intended them to use it the way you're doing it, and talking with users. So the best for tools there, talking with users is a good way to have them with beta users themselves and just mapping it out before you even put any code down.
It seems like the examples you use take less than a day. How do you determine how much time or effort to use for the skateboard, or where do you set the boundaries?
That's a great question. I hadn't ever thought about it, honestly. So I am going to answer this one a bit off the cuff, but the way I sort of look at it is what's the smallest meaningful step I can take that I will learn something. And if you, or I should say, when I take that approach, it typically results in something very, I would say, small, right? Like emailing 10 users or the Google form. I don't remember because it's been a year and a half, but it probably took less than a day to sort of come up with what we want in it, and then to just like create that first version, right? So this probably isn't always the right way to do it, but I tend to gravitate towards really trying to slice it as small as possible. And this is, prior to DigitalOcean, I've done my own startup. I've been employee number one at another startup. So I'm very sort of used to an environment where you have to keep the ball moving every day, or you won't be there tomorrow. And so I think in many cases it can work pretty well, although I'm sure there are cases where maybe I'm going too small. Maybe I need to think a little bit bigger on my MVPs, and I might be able to learn more.
Just wanted to add on one thing that you do really well there, John, is hopefully you have someone to work with. If you don't, maybe you can have a friend or a colleague that you can bounce some ideas off. And one thing that John does really good with the engineering team is we'll take a specific thing and we think we have the skateboard, and we'll come back and we'll do our planning for how we're going to do our next week of work. And John is really great about asking questions about, well, what if we took this idea that we have on three days of work and we make it 1 day of work? What could we do for 1 day of work? And it's a great conversation with the good folks to say, well, we can't really do 1 day of work because that's not going to give us anything tangible. It's not going to help us out. We're not going to be able to get feedback from folks. It's not going to be something that's going to provide value to our users. And then, John, well, what if we did what if we'd had it on a 2-day and we provided just this? And then we get to thinking, like, yeah, I guess we could do that, right? So the point that I want to call it there is, if you can find someone to bounce some ideas off of and ask questions like, what if, and drill down and tell me why and what if to that, that really helps get down to a point where you can figure out, is this a point where we can get value to users? The other point I think is interesting as well is, if you have a good user base and you think you have a skateboard and you provide it out to users and you got good feedback loop, they'll tell you quickly, there's no value here, right? It's like, okay, maybe I need to go back and do one more iteration, right, to folks. So getting things out to users and getting feedback will help you adjust whether you've gone too far or gone too little, or you're right on track and can go to a second iteration. So bounce some ideas off of someone and ask your users.
Yeah, and these two examples were no code MVPs, right? But we had another recent example on the team where it was very similar to what Antonio just described, where we had sort of like a bigger feature that would have had a lot of scope to it if we sort of did it end to end. And where we ended up was we actually broke it down to the point where we just created a basic endpoint that did one very basic thing, just basically accepted a value and put it into a database. And we did an A/B test on the front end with it to see if users would actually use this new sort of toggle that we added, and we found that they really weren't. So we didn't invest. It was maybe a day or two of someone on Antonio's team's time and maybe half a day of a front-end engineer's time, but we were able to avoid what could have been a pretty large investment in a sort of a deeper set of features, and we were able to avoid that because the team, I think, collectively is aligned that we're willing to make a small investment if it either justifies the bigger investment or it disproves the hypothesis we had in terms of why we wanted to make the bigger investment.
We have a specific question about a use case with small businesses really struggling during the pandemic right now. So with COVID-19, small businesses like grocery stores, for example, can't allow for more than 50 people in the shop at one time. And this one audience member would love to know, what would be an MVP for a simple booking system where you let people book a time slot to shop for groceries?
Yeah, Antonio, I'm at a loss. Any ideas?
It's a good question. The part that is really interesting to me that I didn't see the immediate value until it was working was the fact of having a first iteration and putting it out to folks intrinsically creates a feedback loop for you. So in a lot of these MVPs, we may not know what the end solution looks like. And I think if you're developing a product and you're trying to develop to the best value to your users, you will stay open to your idea being molded and hopefully materially looking different at the end of the iterations than what you first started. So a lot of times I think with the reservation system, we might think it needs to have like an app, it needs to have a website, and it has a bunch of functionality in there. But I guess what I would say is if you have a couple customers that you know, and this is John's point, he just emailed 10 folks, and that's not like any statistically significant thing. But if you even have a handful of customers who frequent your shop, and you could at a minimum email them on some ideas and say, hey, what if we did this? What if we did literally, like I remember when you had to go to a desk and you'd pull a ticket and you had like a number system, putting out some ideas to folks and just having the feedback loop where you're engaging folks. And they're number one saying, hey, my opinion is valued. Number two, they're giving you ideas. They're giving ideas where they can bounce things off of. And then you're starting with something that could be very simple and seeing if they're going to get value out of that. I think that's a great first step before saying like, hey, I need to do the full app website monitoring system. Is maybe first step is like, can I just talk to 5 of my users and get feedback to them and start a feedback loop that I can continue on through the whole process, right? So while it's not an answer on how you specifically do it, I would at least start and look at that as a first option.
And while Antonio gave me some time to think about other ideas, there are apps like Schedule Once or Sign Up Genius that you could actually use to MVP this concept, right? So you could go to a grocery store and say, hey, I know you're trying to sort of maximize the number of people who can be in the store. Keep it in mind you want to stick with the COVID related restrictions. So you could use one of these services, and they have free versions and they also have like very low cost paid versions, where you basically stand up a sign up page for a grocery store. You could even add your branding to it, I imagine on like a premium version. And you could kind of do this with one grocery store and sort of see how it works or how it doesn't work or what people like, what they don't like. And you could get a sense for, is this something that maybe you would kind of lean into and start to really build, versus, you know, maybe it's something that doesn't make sense, and you discover that again by what Antonio was saying, really kind of getting it out there and letting the users sort of shape the idea along with you.
Very cool. One audience member also shared that you could publish a Google Calendar as a web page.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Real quick with there, let's like the fact that John's also saying, even as engineering, as we don't need to build everything from scratch. There are great open source community out there, and when you're using it and you're installing bugs and adding features, that's helping the community. There's a lot of small SaaS products you can pull off the shelf and just get that feedback and figure out what are the things I need to do on top of that to provide my niche, my idea, and provide value. So there's a lot of things you can do open source and just regular out there small SaaS tool that you could build upon and see, this is a great first iteration. What is the feedback? I'm sorry, Samantha, you're going to say?
Another question just came in about the chicken and egg concern. So if a product's value relies on the consensus of an active community, isn't there a risk with an MVP being an accurate measurement of consumer attitude in the unfinished product?
So the idea is, I think it sounds like what the question is the MVP, is it not enough to get an accurate view of what the community really thinks? So if I understand the question correctly, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about this on the fly here, but the way, to go back to what Antonio was saying about MVPs, you have the sort of the skateboard, the scooter, the bike, the motorcycle, right? And you kind of go through that process. If you look at a lot of the tools, some of which you mentioned, right? The features they provided on day one, I'm imagining, were a lot smaller than what's out there today, right? A lot more basic, and also you can even look potentially before those products were launched. Dropbox is actually a really good example of this. Dropbox, before they had even really shipped the product, they were able to gauge demand for their product by creating basically like a landing page and I think a video. And this was like many years ago, but I remember it was a pretty widely discussed story because they were able to really see that there was demand for this application sort of during the process of them building it. And Dropbox then versus Dropbox today, there's umpteen zillion more features they've added in, but that MVP, I think, was enough to see like there's something here and we should invest more in it. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but that was kind of where my mind went when you were asking about trying to get consensus of an active community and critical mass. I think with MVPs, can you get a initial group of users excited about what you're doing and then kind of build on that? So kind of start with a niche or kind of a small group of engaged users, and then it kind of grows from there as they get excited and talk about and sort of use your product, share your product, and use features that maybe encourage them to connect with others.
I wanted to add, because I wrestled with this myself. I would say, first and foremost, that it is a risk, right? But when I looked at it from an engineering point of view and saying like, hey, we really need statistical significance for user-generated content, how to make sure we have consensus that this is an accurate measurement of what we want to do for the feature. And that's where we want to get to. Where I wrestled as an engineer is, if we didn't do that, our opinions were just ours. They were just our teams. There was just, the scope was just what we thought we should do. And the idea of an MVP is being able to collect some more information so you can broaden your scope and your data, specifically for things where you need more consensus. If we wouldn't have done the MVPs early on, our features would have just been scoped to what our team thought they would have been. So as an engineering manager, I would have loved to have statistical significance, and it is a risk, but it at least provided more data to us than what our team's collective intelligence would bring in, and that helped us guide our decision thinking. I'll also say in any risk, you got to be able to take a look at the data and figure out, like, does this make sense for us? Is this the right direction we want to go? Does this validate some of our hypothesis, or does this make us question some of our hypothesis? So while an MVP is good to collect data, it shouldn't be, you know, a replacement for just good product design and just good engineering design. But it does bring in a lot of objective data that your team didn't have before, that you can then sift through the data and figure out, does this help validate? Do we need to form another hypothesis? Do we need to go a different direction? And provides more insights than you had before.
Thank you both. Regarding feedback, is it preferable to ask open or closed-ended questions to users, either to guide the user to disprove or prove our hypothesis, or have them give open feedback and get from their answers stuff we might have missed in our original hypothesis? I'm sure a balance between the two is preferable, but which approach is more useful for an MVP?
I have an opinion on it, and I'll love to hear, Antonio, what you have to think as well. So I think for brand new products, I think open-ended is ideal, because that gives you the opportunity to ask questions like, what is your biggest pain point related to X? And there's a book called the Ask Method, which I think is really good in terms of allowing you to use that specific open-ended question in a survey, and then from there actually taking the responses, being able to categorize them, and then use that information to really craft the ideal sort of product and positioning for that audience based on their pain point. So again, open-ended, I think early on is really really powerful, and I think the preferred way to go if, again, brand new product.
Brand new, I would agree with John in that it's good to have open-ended questions, because you're still in discovery mode yourself. So there may be something that you just didn't think of that the user provides that you could literally learn from. Like you said, ideally it's a mix between the two as you go on in the experimentation, so you can validate the quick answer and see if you're getting better. Like, you know, quick, I've seen some great UX designers just be able to put a happy face, you know, sad, you know, neutral and happy in front of users, and ask them to slide a coin overall, you know, are you feeling sad or are you feeling happy about the design? And that's a quick feedback loop. It's binary, yes or no, or, you know, where you feel out. And you can, as you do more experiments, it's good to gauge how you went back from first iteration. Folks are sad, hopefully you're getting towards happy, maybe went back down to sad. So the binary answers are good when you want to actually measure how you're progressing. But early discovery, I think, is good because folks are open-ended questions, because folks are going to hopefully provide you some insights you didn't have before. But as you continue on, it'd be good to at least have maybe one that you can try to measure quantitatively, how are you doing?
Wonderful. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to ask them in the chat now. I'll wait a few more seconds here to see if there are more questions. In the meantime, John and Antonio, do you have any parting thoughts or words of wisdom for the audience?
Hopefully, it's goes without saying, but make sure you're having fun along the process. So find someone, either community, friend, colleague, that you can have fun with. And have fun with means that you can ask some questions for, develop some hypothesis that you're deeply interested in actually figuring out what other people want to do about it, and that you're passionate about creating. And if you can have fun with it and you have a deep passion for it, you're gonna, you know, formulate some interesting hypotheses, put it out to folks, and then your conversations with those users are going to be more engaging. You're going to find folks in community that are also like-minded and they want to invest their time into it. And those are going to be healthy feedback loops when you're engaged and you find other folks who are engaged, and the fruits come from that. So hopefully it goes without saying, but I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say build the MVP muscle. And so certainly if you're developing technology products, right, this is very applicable. But I know a lot of folks certainly are working on maybe an app on the side, or they are moonlighting working on another project, right? And those are all opportunities to come up with MVPs. Like the example about the grocery stores was a great example. That's an MVP you could test pretty easily without a lot of effort in parallel to your day job or in parallel to whatever you're working on. So trying to come up with those ideas and really build that mindset, because as you do more and more MVPs across your work and also maybe other things that you're working on the side, you're just going to really build that muscle, and your mind's going to start to gravitate towards, how can I MVP this thing? And once you're at that point, then you're going to sort of see MVPs everywhere, and it's actually really empowering, because it basically, what that sort of causes, I think, is you start to see opportunity everywhere. And that's kind of really what's exciting me about this MVP stuff, is that it really allows you to identify and then test opportunities rapidly. And if you do this, if you create 100 MVPs, I'm willing to bet 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them is actually going to be a pretty great idea. So that's why we've sort of left it with this slide of what will you MVP, because we really believe that this stuff works.
Amazing. One last question. Is it a good idea to set up a quick HTML web page as an MVP or a simple WordPress page?
I err on, depending on your skill set, but I err on the either a Ghost or a WordPress site, specifically because there's just so many great forms out there that look really professional and really polished, to just add in your content in there, add your pictures, add your wording into there. A lot of forms and templates you can either use off the shelf for free or pay a couple bucks for, and get really good looking website that you could have. Now, if you're pretty comfortable with HTML and you can create that yourself, that's great. But for a lot of folks are saying, hey, I don't have a lot of experience in setting up a website, and I just want to, get some content out there. I have the things. WordPress is nice because it also provides you the ability to update it, and has kind of an administration interface, has other folks update it, and just a lot of good templates out there. There's also a lot of good, quick spin up places you can spin up a WordPress or a Ghost blog really easily and quickly see it with under an hour. Probably have it up and running and start changing your content right away. So I would start there, but I would tailor it to your use.
Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment, and that like for me, you don't want me doing HTML. It's gonna be pretty ugly. Whereas with WordPress, I've been using it for years, and it's pretty easy to get something up and running. And also, there's all the free plugins out there too, so you can add basic functionality to almost like create an app just with WordPress using stuff that's off the shelf. Or again, there's certainly free plugins. There's also low cost paid plugins. There's SaaS services you can plug into them. That's the other thing about MVPs we didn't really talk about, is that certainly you have your time you can invest in an MVP, like sending 10 emails. It didn't cost me anything, but sometimes it's actually worth to spend a little bit of money on your MVP. And by a little, I mean go out and sign up for the premium version of Schedule Once, which is like $5 or $10 a month, to test this sort of grocery store scheduling concept, right? Like it's at least obviously depends by geography in terms of if that cost is affordable or not. But I think that sometimes a very small monetary investment can actually go a long way in helping you to sort of make that MVP just a little bit bigger, I guess, in terms of letting you learn a little bit more. And if you think about what your time is worth, right? Your time, let's say you're a software engineer, right? Your time is worth quite a bit, right? And so spending $10 for a month to really have an MVP be a little bit larger, if you will, in terms of maybe using a third-party SaaS tool or buying a plugin or something like that, it can actually be worth it in the end, because you just learn a lot more because you've added that functionality, and it didn't really cost you a whole heck of a lot.
One thing that John really guides our team really well on is, again, what the heart of an MVP, I feel like, is getting something to a user that they can, elicit some response from. So the nice thing about a web page is that if you have an idea for something and you can detail what the features are and what you want it to be, even if you don't have a working prototype yet, one thing that John has done really well for us is, in a lot of web pages, you have a call to action button, and use that call to action button as an engineer. I would love for that button to do a bunch of things that provide a bunch of value. But that CTA could be as simple as sign up for interest. When we ship this, be the first, enter your email address here and be the first beta user that we'll contact to get feedback in. And then there you start developing your feedback loop to tell users and hopefully maybe engage with them, set up a call with them, and have a conversation with them. So I think it's great to set up a web page, but the value is, you know, if you can get to a web page really easily, like a WordPress, that you can then put your content in there and get that out to users under an hour, and quickly set up a CTA that says, enter your email for beta customers, you can quickly start measuring, are folks even seeing your idea? You can put up, you know, Google Analytics real quickly onto that web page and see how many people are visiting the web page, how many people are even clicking on the button, or is the button in the wrong place, and start running just quick experiments from there. Once you can actually get someone to click on the CTA and start filling in email addresses, then you start filling in your feedback loop, and you can start, you know, giving folks prototypes and just setting up interviews even before you even start doing any code, having those small MVPs and setting up your iterative feedback loops. So as fast as you can get to that point, it doesn't have to be full-blown MVP. It could simply be enter your email address and start the conversation there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John and Antonio, and thank you everyone for joining and for asking great questions about what and how you'll MVP. Happy building, measuring, and iterating, and tell us what you'd like to learn more about next. With that, this is a wrap. I hope we'll see you again soon. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thanks.